that.
Okay. So I wanted to let everybody know before we start that we only have 3 questions left in our list after today. So if you have more questions to offer, please get those to me so we can keep on going with our mixed bag things.
Oh, yes.
I rely on you to give me the questions so that we can keep on going with this theme. If we run out of questions, that's okay. We can come up with a new topic, but we're pushing toward 50 questions. So
Wow.
I would love to hit that. I think this is number 45. So we're almost there to 50.
And Katie, can you send a text or something to the mostly like the first group people, the morning group people who normally have been coming for some time, to tell them the same thing? Because they have questions too.
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
I'll send it to everybody and remind them that they need to be sending those to me.
And Natalia and Julia too. It would be really nice to have them back.
Yes, I haven't gotten one of Natalia's epic emails with 20 or 30 questions in them for a while.
I mean, I think at this point I just give up because you never answer them. So
depends on the question.
Kevin has one.
What's Kevin's question?
What was your question? If a man,
if the argument for creationism is that man is a sufficient, humans are a sufficiently complicated thing, and thus must have been.
Can you just stop? Because I cannot.
Paraphrase.
No, I can't paraphrase that.
I can sort of hear you, Kevin.
No, it's just Katie. They're expecting you right now.
Crazy.
No, don't be embarrassed.
Hey, Katie. Okay, so question for you then is, if humans must have been created by a creator, why would the creator not also have been created by a creator?
The first cause. I can talk about that.
Okay.
You sure you can answer this? Or is it going to be open-ended again?
No, that's actually so there is an entire field in religion that talks about that question all the time.
Okay, I'll make him listen to that.
The unmoved mover.
Thank you, Katie.
You're welcome.
How about, do animals have souls?
Oh, we might bring in a guest speaker on that, because Pastor Janet Chapman over at the Disciples of Christ Church just got back from a sabbatical. She went to Rome for 3 months to study St. Francis of Assisi and the relationship, the spiritual lives of animals. So she would have a lot to say about that. I wonder if she would be willing to come. I bet she would. All right. I'll keep thinking about them. And you can always email me, text me. Call me, send a carrier pigeon, whatever you need to do. All right. So today's question is, what is the relationship between Christianity and evolution? Ooh. So I was thinking about this question because there were a lot of different ways that I could go about addressing this question, but it was specifically, what is the relationship between? So I decided that I wanted to talk about kind of the history of Christianity and evolution, because there isn't really just one relationship between Christianity and evolution. There is a relationship between each Christian and evolution. There's a relationship between possibly each denomination or Christian tradition and evolution, but there isn't really one answer to this question. So I will say, though, that the one thing that we do have to assume from the question itself is that there is a relationship between Christianity and evolution. And that means if there's a relationship, that means that they are not just totally opposite concepts, diametrically opposed for all eternity, that requires you to reject one if you accept the other. Because that would not be a relationship. That would be, I don't know, what's the opposite of a relationship? Not non-coexistent or something. And I agree with that assumption. I think if we read the question and we say, well, this is what the question is assuming, I'm fine with that because I agree. And in fact, even the Pope agrees. In 1950, the Pope put out a statement that evolution is not incompatible with Christian faith, and several popes since then have supported, confirmed that statement by the earlier Pope. In fact, I think this one was John Paul II, said that evolution is more than a hypothesis. It's not just a theory, it is how it is. And Catholics need to accept that. A lot of Catholics did not and still don't, but that's their problem to wrestle with, because isn't the Pope supposed to tell them what they're supposed to think? I don't know. That's a question for another day. So what I want to do with this class to address what is this relationship is to give you a brief history of evolutionary theory and how it kind of relates to philosophy and religion. And then we'll go back and we will add in a discussion of creationism, because typically people who think about evolution and Christianity having some kind of beef with one another, so to speak, are really actually talking about Christians who believe in creationism, which is not the same thing as being a Christian. You don't have to believe in creationism to be a Christian. So we're going to talk about evolution, and then we're going to talk about creationism, then we're going to talk about that relationship. So I actually am going to answer this question today, Natalia. Shock of all shocks. Aren't you glad you came? So evolutionary theory is actually a lot older than Charles Darwin. The ancient Greeks had some basic idea and theories and thoughts and ideas about how humans came about. This is a picture of Anaximander of Miletus. He lived in 600-ish BC, and he thought that humans could be descended from fish, because he said that humans require long-term care from their parent as babies, and other mammals do not, at least not the extended time of support from their families. And he saw in certain species of fish that same kind of thing, that the fish would stick around with their parent fish for a longer time than other types of animals do. And so he thought maybe humans are descended from fish. He suggested that perhaps earlier humans before his own time were born in the water and spent only part of their lives on the land, and that over time the humans spent more and more time on land until finally they spent most of their time on land and only a little bit in the water when they would go swimming or something, or bathing or whatever, or fishing or something. So this is, this is old idea. And then as time goes on, you kind of see even the development of not just these kind of random ideas, but actually kind of a reason, a concept here. So for example, we get to Cicero, who was about 500 years after Anaximander. He was around the year 100 BCE. And he was reporting on beliefs from a popular philosopher named Zeno, who was about 200 years older than him. So this is now about 300 BCE. And he said that Zeno taught that nature shows clear evidence, he says, clear evidence of being designed for a purpose. And that purpose is, quote, to secure for the world the structure best fitted for survival. And so Cicero, speaking kind of using the words of Zeno or the ideas of Zeno, this earlier thinker, kind of gives us the first, or at least an early example of what we call teleology. Teleos in Greek means the end things. And so teleology is the study of purposes. Why? What is the goal of this thing, whatever it is that we're doing? And so you can ask that about anything. You know, what is the goal of this class? What is the goal of human life? What is the goal of driving across town? Anything that happens, you can do teleology and think about, you know, what is the purpose? What is the goal here? And for Cicero, he thought that the purpose of nature is to secure for the world the structure best fitted for survival. So you can see there, even some of those words that become popular when we get to Darwin, survival of the fittest, right? So then we enter into the early Christian period. And a lot of Christians would be shocked and chagrined to know that a lot of the early church fathers and mothers, presumably, we don't really have much of them, but parents are actually not quite as dedicated to creationism as perhaps some of the modern Christians are. Gregory of Nyssa, who was a bishop in Cappadocia in the late 300s, so this is now after Christ, this is the 300s AD or CE, Common Era. He says, Scripture informs us that the deity proceeded by a sort of graduated and ordered advance to the creation of man. After the foundations of the universe were laid, as the history records, man did not appear on the earth at once, but the creation of the brutes preceded him and the plants preceded them. Thereby, Scripture shows that the vital forces blended with the world of matter according to a gradation. First, it infused itself into insensate nature, and in continuation of this, advance into the sentient world, and then ascended to intelligent and rational beings. So Gregory is telling us that there is some kind of progression in the creation. And he's right. You know, if you think about Genesis chapter 1, the order in which things are created or you know, expressed to have been created is in this order. Plants come first, then animals, and then humans. And so Gregory is pointing this out, that there is an order in that it's kind of the development of complexity, the movement from simple to more complicated to more complicated to more complicated. So interesting that he would point that out. Then we get to our friend Augustine of Hippo. He is now about 100 years after Gregory. And he is, I don't think you can really overstate how important this guy is to Christianity and to the development of Christian thought. He and Thomas Aquinas, who I'm going to talk about next, between the two of them, they pretty much had the whole ball game for hundreds and hundreds of years. And Augustine, he had a lot to say about everything, but he actually had some things to say about how we are supposed to interpret the creation and in terms of, you know, what we see around us in the world and what we're supposed to believe about nature. He said, "We know the days of creation are different from the ordinary day of which we are familiar. The things God had potentially created came forth in the course of time on different days according to their different kinds, and the rest of the earth was filled with its various kinds of creatures, which produced their appropriate forms in due time." So this doesn't necessarily seem like it's a big deal, but I want to point out to you that word potentially. The things God had potentially created. So what Augustine is suggesting here is that when we have the story in Genesis chapter 1 of how God created, God didn't actually create those objects or those creatures or those things at that particular moment. God created the potentiality of those things. It's kind of like God created seeds and not trees, or eggs but not chickens. Augustine is suggesting that all at the same time, and we don't know how much time this took, because he says the days of creation are different from our 24-hour day. We don't know what a day is. We don't know if that's a real day or if it's eons or if it's 3 seconds. But what happened in that time that God spent creating was not that God created all the things that could ever exist and will ever exist. God created the possibility of those things that would come about in reality in time, as he says, as the rest of the earth was filled, to produce those appropriate forms. And so this idea of potentiality in creating, God creates potentiality, not the reality. This opens up a whole lot of different ideas about that can relate to evolution. And this didn't just die off. By the time we get to Thomas Aquinas, who is from the 1200s, so this is even later in, during the Middle Ages, he talks about this potentiality thing too. He says, on the day on which God created the heaven and the earth, he created also every plant of the field, not indeed actually, but, quote, before it sprung up in the earth, end quote, that is potentially. All things were not distinguished and adorned together, not from a want of power on God's part as requiring time in which to work, but that due order might be observed in the instituting of the world. So Thomas says that God created every plant of the field, everything in heaven and the earth, not in actuality, but in potentiality. God created the potential for everything to exist. And he says it didn't happen that way because God couldn't do it. God could have done it, but God chose not to, so that due order might be observed as the world develops. So not only is there space in this early and medieval theology for ideas like the development of creation and nature and evolution potentially, but they actually think that was done by God on purpose to give space so that order could be observed in the creation, so that it's like a blessing from God that not everything just poofed into existence all at once. So really interesting. God gives grace and love to the creation, not just in creating it, but in allowing it to self-govern, allowing it to develop, allowing it to grow, and not just making it stagnant. And so for people like Augustine and Thomas and others who were Christians before the Industrial Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment, the idea that God could create and the universe could develop over time through natural functions, these two ideas are not mutually exclusive. These two things actually, in fact, go hand in hand and are both necessary for our understanding of who God is. So really interesting that, we don't have that concept so much anymore. So any questions up to that point before we move on to some more sciencey people?
I do. How is that not a direct clash to Adam and Eve?
We are going to talk about that. We'll talk about that as we get through.
Just a comment from my childhood pastor, the pastor who confirmed me. His explanation was, if you get hung up on Genesis 1, you miss out on a whole lot of good in the Bible. So that's how he explained the disconnect, or the apparent disconnect.
Okay, fair. there's more to come. I think that Augustine would agree with that. We're going to talk about him again, actually, when we get to creationism, because he had some things to say about Genesis that are used for that to support creationism too, not just evolution. All right, so I think something that's really important to understand is that I don't bring these people to you when we're talking about the history of evolutionary theory because we're Christians and we're trying to study this from a Christian perspective. I bring these to you because there was no such thing as scientists at this time. Thomas Aquinas was the closest thing that you could get to a scientist in 1200. Augustine was the closest thing that you could get to a scientist in 600. When you talked about the nature of the world, you were talking about philosophy, and science was just kind of wrapped up into all of that. But it wasn't until later that we started to see the development of science as its own thing, its own concept, its own field. So this is not now, we're looking at, we've kind of jumped forward from 1200 with Thomas, and now we're looking at the late 18th century. So this is the late 1700s. There was a French philosopher, so see, we're still even talking about people who claim to be philosophers, not scientists, doing things that we now would understand to be something that a scientist would do. So this guy, his name is Georges Louis Leclerc, and he suggested that what we understand to be species are just well-marked varieties of the same kind of original concept, original type of creature that were modified from this original form by environmental factors. So he thought that, for example, lions and tigers and leopards and house cats might all share a common ancestor. And so this is a pretty big leap toward what we now understand to be evolution. But he still didn't grasp completely where then that ancestor would have come from. At this time, the belief about the common ancestors of these different species, they believed that they came about through spontaneous generation, it was called. And spontaneous generation is kind of self-explanatory. It's literally, they just spontaneously exist out of nothing. Living creatures coming randomly out of non-living material from which it tends to appear. So for example, at this time, they believed that fleas are a living creature that spontaneously generates from dust. Why? Because dirty stuff often has fleas in it, right? If you are dirty, if you're spending a lot of time in dirt, you end up getting fleas. Why is that? Well, that must be where the fleas come from. They spontaneously generate out of that non-organic matter of the dirt, the dust, and then you have fleas. So it makes sense, if you're thinking about a world where there's no such thing as science and they're just trying to ask these questions, where do fleas come from? Well, let me observe what's going on around me. Fleas tend to come where things are dirty, so maybe they come from dirt. Well, how does that work? How do you get something that's alive from something that's not alive? Well, they just happen randomly. We don't know why, but that's what it is. And that's as far as they had gotten at this point. But still, still kind of a decent step forward. Then we hit the 19th century. So this is the 1800s now. And formal science really starts to kind of come together. Fields of geology and paleontology particularly become incredibly popular among people who want to study and just your average person who's interested in learning more about their world. And so what happens is people start digging in the ground and they discover some things that call into question what has been accepted as kind of the assumed history and understanding of the world. They discovered mammoths and they said, these skeletons, these fossils are too different than modern elephants for us to believe this is nothing but an elephant. This is a different species, but we don't have this animal on Earth anymore. And so they discovered that a species can become extinct. They had never known that before. They would dig down and they would find all of these different rock layers and fossil records. And they started to question, well, how old is the Earth? Is it really only a few thousand years old? Or is it much, much older than that? And it was during the, up to about 1840, 1850, the scientific community kind of left the idea of humans alone. They developed understandings of how animals have developed, how the Earth itself has developed, but they felt that humans could not possibly be that old. But in the 1840s, that started to change. They at first they believed that the Earth is very, very, very old. They didn't know how old, millions of years, billions of years, but that humans, again, spontaneously generated only a few thousand years prior to the present. But they started to still discover more and more fossil records, more and more evidence of what the ancient world looked like. And they discovered stone tools that were connected and nearby to the fossils of extinct animal species. And so it became much more widely accepted by about the mid 1860s that human history was actually a lot more compatible with evolution than with this other idea about spontaneous generation. That humans, that there actually is evidence out there that we can find that humans developed over the course of time, just like the Earth developed over the course of time and other animal species developed over the course of time. And this was a huge situation that came about. Now, of course, in the United States, this is when there's all kinds of upheaval happening. The Civil War is raging. So there's a lot of political turmoil. There's a lot of social upheaval with slavery debates and things. And now we're going to start, having people questioning where they came from and what their ancestors were like. And so this is really scary stuff for a lot of people. But we also have this interesting development of attempting to kind of wrap our minds around this, attempting to see patterns in all of this evidence that we're finding. So in 1844, there was a Scottish scientist, if you want to call him that, named Robert Chambers, and he published a book. He published it anonymously because he was afraid of how people would respond to it. And, he didn't want people to know that it was him at first. He called it Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. And in this book, he basically claimed that the fossil record, that all the records that have been developed and dug up, show that life developed from simple to complex. He said that you can look at the records that we've got in terms of pre-literate history or pre-recorded history, and you can actually see a development that is like a ladder, that life developed from simple to complex. So it went from single cell organisms up to basic multi-cell bacteria, into plants, into animals, and finally humans. And Robert Chambers said that humans are the last step in the ascent of animal life. Humans are as high as you can get. You can't develop any further than that. So it's kind of the top rung of the ladder, but that is this very structured developmental process for Robert Chambers in his time. But then we get to Charles Darwin. And Darwin had a whole new concept of what this development looked like. Darwin said, no, we don't have this ladder. concept. Instead, we've got natural selection. We've got environmental shifts that cause changes in biological need. He said, change is not a progression upward, but a series of branches that is just absolute chaos. So he said, ladder, no ladder. Instead, it looks more like this. This is a literal image from one of his journals. And you can see that there are branches that cut off. They've got like the line on them. And then there are branches that continue that don't have the line on them. And the cutoff lines are extinction, or the attempt, the randomness of the genetic mutations that he is suggesting don't last, because those genetic mutations don't support survival of the fittest. If you've got your giraffe that has a longer neck than everybody else, that giraffe is much more likely to go on to procreate and create more giraffes that have a longer neck. Whereas the ones that have shorter necks will have a harder time surviving. And so they won't be able to procreate at the same rate. And so slowly over the course of time, the giraffe's neck will get longer and longer and longer until we have this weirdo horse that has a super long neck. And so he rejects this very structured, orderly ladder in favor of the kind of scattered, random progression. So that's kind of where we get to the end of evolutionary theory. It's not the end, but we're going to backtrack to creationism. But before we do that, what questions do you have for me about evolutionary theory? I am not an expert on evolutionary theory by any means, but if you have any questions, I can try to answer them. Is that good enough for now?
Yeah, well, so how would some of these theorists look at modern day attempts at conservation and preservation of species? Would they say that that's interfering with the natural progression of things, or would they commend us for making an effort, or what?
That I don't know. I would assume that different people would have different opinions about that. Some would say that the human human evolution and our ability to control our environment is the height of evolution. It's the top ladder rung, and so what we do to our world is irrelevant, because we're using the evolutionary tools that we have created for ourselves, and so we can do what we want, and to try to fight that, to try to limit that, is anti-nature. The point of nature is to just keep going. I mean, we've got all these feral cats in our yard, and they fight each other, and occasionally they kill each other, and we find a dead cat on our lawn, and the other cats aren't standing around talking about what they can do to prevent another cat from dying in the future. They just go on. Okay, good, one of my competitors is gone, let's move on. But then others would probably say, no, part of the development of humans and our evolution is the development of awareness of the fact that what we do affects other things and other systems. And so because of that, we have ethics in a way that nothing else that exists has ever had. And so we have a responsibility to use that tool that has developed to be aware of how we use our resources. So I think they would probably, depending on who you ask, they would disagree. Obviously, I didn't get to give you the full scope here of all of it, just kind of bits and pieces, but even these people, I'm sure, would have different opinions about that. All right, so now let's kind of go back, rewind, but this time we will move forward through an understanding of creationism. And then when we get back to the same spot that we were in before, then we'll talk about how evolution impacted the development of creationism. So, like our theory of evolution, creationism has some roots. We can find roots for creationism all the way back in the Greeks. Again, we've got Plato and his concept of essentialism. Plato's most famous teaching, his most famous idea, was that individual things exist in imperfect manifestations of what he calls the ideal form, capital F, form of that thing. So there's the spiritual realm where there is the perfect form of a thing. And then there's the material world where there are imperfect manifestations of that. So for example, out there somewhere in the mystical, spiritual, supernatural world, there is a concept, cow. And we have never seen the perfect form of cow, but we have seen many, many imperfect forms of cow. And so somewhere, somehow, in our hearts and our minds, we all know what the perfect form cow is, what it looks like, even though we've never seen it, because we've seen so many different iterations of it. Maybe that cow doesn't have quite the right black and white spots that, you know, that we think is appropriate for a cow, or somehow, you know, maybe this cow's horns aren't quite the right length, or maybe this cow's hooves are misshapen. We know when we see it what is correct and what isn't correct. It's like a dog show, you know. There's the ideal form of what a schnauzer is, and then there are all of the examples of schnauzers that are entered into the competition, and they are all judged against this perfect ideal that doesn't actually exist. So that's what Plato said. And this doesn't seem to have anything to do with evolution and creationism, but if you think about it, it kind of fits a little bit, because if there is such a thing as a perfect form of everything that exists in the world, then there's no possibility that living creatures came about by chance. There exists out there in the spirit realm the perfect form of every single thing that exists. And if it doesn't exist in a form, then it can't exist in the material world as an imperfect example of a form, because there's no form for it. And so for Plato, there is this idea that there are only so many things that can exist in the world. And then, you know, again, jumping really quickly forward by several hundred years, we get into the Christian world. So Origen was one of those early church fathers in about the 200s AD, and he wrote. Actually, I want to read this to you because I think it's kind of interesting. So this is Origen kind of arguing that a literal interpretation, a literal understanding of Genesis 1 doesn't make any sense. He says, "For who that has understanding will suppose that the first and second and third day and the evening and the morning existed without a sun and moon and stars," because of course they weren't created until the fourth day. "And that the first day was, as it were, also without a sky. And who is so foolish as to suppose that God, after the manner of a husbandman, planted a paradise in Eden towards the east and placed in it a tree of life, visible and palatable, so that one tasting of the fruit by the bodily teeth obtained life. And again, that one was a partaker of good and evil by masticating what was taken from the tree. And if God is said to walk in the paradise in the evening and Adam to hide himself under a tree, I do not suppose that anyone doubts that these things figuratively indicate certain mysteries, the history having taken place in appearance and not literally." So Origen is challenging what we end up kind of having as the assumed interpretation of this stuff, that it is a literal, factual history of what happened in the creation. he challenges it with logic. He says, it doesn't make any sense that you could have 3 days and there would be no sun yet. It doesn't make any sense that there could be a day without a sky. It doesn't make any sense that God would physically plant this tree and physically place it in a garden, and that you have to physically chew on it in order to receive life. Nobody is saying that. Nobody is thinking that. And if you are, then he says you are without understanding, which is kind of harsh for, quite a few people today. Nobody reads that about Origen, I guess, nowadays. So he is continuing to help us to challenge the way that we are reading this story, so that we're not taking it literally in a way that would affect our ability to kind of understand and accept some kind of theory of evolution. Then we have our friend Augustine. We already talked about him and how he says some things that could be construed to be supportive of evolutionary theory. But he also has some ideas that kind of challenge that, because like I said, these guys were not writing, so they could prove whether the Bible was or wasn't scientific. They didn't care about that. There was no such thing as science at the time. And so Augustine, he talked about how the first chapter of Genesis should be read as an allegory. It should be read to learn something. It should be read as a story that teaches, and not be read literally and as a historical record. So similar to Origen. But Augustine says we should read the rest of Genesis as a literal and historical record. Not the first chapter, but all the rest of it. But he still, even in that, holds on to the idea that we should be humble with our opinions. We should hold on to them lightly and be ready to change our minds when new information comes. Because he says, if we force a literal reading on things that might be read allegorically, then we are actually discrediting our faith. That if we just stubbornly dig our heels in and we say, no, I don't care, what evidence you bring to me about this, I'm going to stick with my literal reading of this, then that's actually a discredit to the faith, Augustine says. So it's important to kind of hold these things lightly, he told us. But as we move through toward the development of creationism proper, we start to see the impulse toward using nature to understand our faith, and then the threat that process actually ends up bringing to our faith. It starts with natural theology. Natural theology is studying nature, which we believe to be the work of God, to help us understand God better. So naturalists, natural theologians believe that we can know who God is by looking at what God made. And so what these people felt was that they could study nature from a more or less scientific position, the word science we would use today, to find evidence for biblical events, to find evidence of, who God is and how God created the world. But the problem with that is that as science started to develop, as people actually started doing this, as they started to engage with nature to figure out who God is and find evidence for biblical events, they found evidence that actually conflicted with what they believed to be the biblical evidence that they were looking for. So, oops, natural theology actually kind of ended up doing the opposite of what it was that they were attempting to do. I think because they were looking for the wrong things. I believe that you can understand God better by studying nature. But in the same way that when we read the Bible, we can't read into it what we're looking for it to tell us. We have to allow the Bible to tell us what it is saying. In the same way, I think that when we are looking at nature and looking for evidence of God, we can't look for something that we already assume is there, like evidence of the flood or evidence of, Adam and Eve, or evidence of Abraham, or evidence of Jericho, or whatever it is. We have to allow nature to speak to us and tell us what it knows about God. We can't start the journey looking for a particular thing. So that kind of started to develop in even in the Middle Ages, and moved forward into the modern era. But then another thing that I think is important when we're thinking about the history of creationism is actually the Reformation. Before the Reformation, reading of the Bible was limited only to people who were educated, as we know, and that's wrong. We should have access to the Bible for everyone. But one of the problems with the Reformation, one of the problems with making the Bible accessible to everyone, is that the way that Christians developed for how to read the Bible was something that was passed down through the universities, through schooling. And so this period of high medieval scholasticism, it was called, where there were these elite people who could go and study the Bible and interpret it and talk to each other about it and figure out what it means, started to get lost, because your average person who didn't go to school and didn't learn all of these different ways of understanding how to read the Bible were reading and interpreting on their own. So before the Reformation, there were all kinds of different interpretations, all kinds of models for reading the Bible. There were allegories, where different elements of the story kind of were supposed to represent different parts of our spiritual lives. There were morality interpretations, kind of like Aesop's fable, where you read the story and you aren't supposed to believe that it's a factual story where dogs speak or whatever, but you're supposed to figure out, what am I supposed to learn from this story? And there was, most importantly, that we don't do at all anymore, is called the anagogical reading. An anagogical reading is supposed to reveal a higher spiritual meaning related usually to what happens after our death. So when you read a story, you're not looking for the surface meaning, you're looking for the deeper meaning related to what happens to us after our deaths. And in fact, some theologians from the medieval period said that the anagogical reading is the, quote, truest or highest sense or interpretation. But that kind of thing requires a lot of education, a lot of training, a lot of practice to understand how you read in those types of ways. And when people on the street could just pick up their Bible and start reading it, they didn't know any of that stuff. And so we start to lose all of these different ways that were considered legitimate, and in sometimes considered more legitimate than in a literal interpretation. We start to lose that because the average person has access to the Bible now. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, obviously. I wouldn't be reading the Bible today if we hadn't done that. But there are, kind of pros and cons to this stuff. Giving everybody access means that we start to kind of dilute the waters and our understanding of how to read the Bible, not just, what it says, but how we understand it. So that's important, I think, because as time moves on, the Bible starts to become read more and more literally, and we start to even make the assumption that there is no other way to read the Bible. So then we start to move toward that kind of scientific period, the development of science, the Age of Enlightenment. And Christian thinkers and non-Christian thinkers too, but Christian thinkers started to try to understand their world better by ordering it, by organizing it. And so the science of taxonomy started to develop. The idea that a biological species is a group that's characterized by its features. And the belief that the seed of one species could never give rise to another species. That if I have, I don't know, white-tailed deer, And that white-tailed deer is going to have a baby that every single time the white-tailed deer has a baby, the next thing is a white-tailed deer, and that it cannot change, that there are unchanging features that are essential to what makes a white-tailed deer, and that white-tailed deer only make white-tailed deer forever. Nothing can ever change in them. And that's how taxonomy developed and started to kind of solidify this idea that that science can be compatible with faith, as long as we hold to these unchanging understandings of the world and our unchanging understanding of the Bible, both of which I think are incorrect, unfortunately. And so during this time, people are struggling with these two ideas. How do you read the Bible? How do you interpret the Bible? How do you understand the Bible in light of new scientific information? And how do you understand and interpret new scientific information in light of what we know about the Bible? So what is the relationship, basically, is what they're asking. The same question that we're asking today. What is the relationship between our faith and science? What is the relationship between Christianity and evolution? They didn't have evolution yet. They're still struggling with kind of the same concept. So in 1696, so this is pretty early, this guy, William Whiston, he wrote a book called A New Theory of the Earth. And he wrote in a context in which people felt threatened by the changing understandings of the world. We have Copernicus and his the world is round ideas coming around. We've got the early movement of the Age of Enlightenment. We've got the early movement of science developing, and the idea that reason is the highest source of truth rather than faith and your church. And so people started to really feel uncomfortable. And so William Whiston wrote his understanding of the earth. And he said that we need to follow 3 different principles when we are trying to understand something new. He said, number 1, the obvious or literal sense of scripture is the true and real one, where no evidence can be given to the contrary. So this is very different than the medieval scholars, the medieval theologians, because he says that the literal sense, the literal interpretation is the highest interpretation. The only reason you would not interpret literally is if there is evidence to the contrary. And then, and only then, do you go to figurative, literary, anagogical, allegorical, morality, any of these other types of interpretation. So he kind of turns that whole thing on its head. Number 2, he says, that which is clearly accountable in a natural way is not without reason to be ascribed to a miraculous power. So see how they're struggling to figure out how you kind of square this circle. We believe in miracles, but we shouldn't be looking for miracles everywhere. If you can come up with a logical, natural explanation for something, you shouldn't call it a miracle. You should say, hey, this is clearly explainable through logic, reason, science, those types of things. And so as time goes on, things become less and less miraculous because we have more and more explanations for them. And then number 3, this is kind of wordy. What ancient tradition asserts of the constitution of nature or of the origin and primitive states of the world is to be allowed for true where it is fully agreeable to scripture, reason, and philosophy. So what he's saying here, in so many words, is if an ancient tradition says something about the nature of nature, what nature is, and we can't find any reason to disagree with it in scripture, reason, or philosophy, then we should just accept it. it can be accepted as true. So he's kind of giving that emphasis, giving that heavier support to what came before rather than new information. So these are, these seem like they're kind of random, but this is actually evidence of a people really struggling with how to incorporate new information into a system that is already complicated, already at risk, already threatened by what's going on in the world. And they're looking for some kind of stability. They're looking for some kind of guidance about how they're supposed to wrestle with this and struggle through this. So that kind of makes me feel good because we're not alone. We're wrestling with new information and how things are changing in our world, and that's nothing new. So that's kind of good news. So as science develops, and this is where we're going to come back around to our Darwin stuff and our evolutionary theory stuff. As science starts to develop in the late 1700s, early 1800s, people are really grasping at, what do I do with this? How do I understand this? And there are several different ideas that start to develop and become popular with people. And one of them was incredibly popular and well received by pretty much everybody for a while there. And it was called gap creationism. And what they were trying to do was figure out how to combine the scientific evidence that people were finding all over the world as in terms of the age of the earth and the development of species that don't exist anymore, and extinct species and species that seem to kind of have similarities to other species but that exist now but are no longer around. All of this stuff is confusing them, and so they want to ask the question, how do we understand this in light of our interpretation of Genesis chapter 1, which by this point we pretty much assume needs to be read literally, because we've kind of lost all of those other possible interpretations. And so what gap creationism says is that the answer is that there is a gap in our written history of the world in the Bible, because the earth existed for billions of years and God created it, and that is evidenced in chapter 1. But there is this huge gap of time from then until chapter 2, because there was some kind of cataclysm, and then there was a new creation that is recorded starting in Genesis chapter 2 that took place starting only a few thousand years ago. So the gap is the earth and the animals were created, who cares how long ago, billions of years ago, trillions of years ago, millions of years ago. And then they spent all this time developing, but then something terrible happened and everything died. And God started again. And that's when humans came into play, this new creation that God created that we start our Bible with. And so this is the first time that the assumption that we have to read Genesis 1 literally and figure out how to fit everything else into it starts to happen. I talked a little bit to you about vestiges of the natural history of creation that was written by that guy who even wrote it anonymously because he was afraid of how people were going to take it. And that, in fact, was a good thing that he was aware that people might not take it great, because that book actually led to a very long debate that resulted in a major Christian split, at least in the United States. Quakers and Unitarians ended up supporting this guy's concept of evolution, remember, he was the one with the spontaneous generation, but that everything from there develops, and that in fact creatures that have similar characteristics came from a common ancestor. Quakers and Unitarians bought into this right away. They were fine with it. But there was a very loud group that did not. And Darwin and his friends would write to each other, and they would write about these people in a derogatory kind of sense, and they would call them creationists. And the creationists believed that all species had been separately created, that they were not developed from a common ancestor and developed into these different varieties. And so this concept, or this terminology of creationist, is actually fairly new. Creationism is fairly new. The concept of, reading the Bible literally is fairly new. But once this took hold, people really grasped onto it, to the point that they actually started to call themselves creationists, and this movement, creationism. And again, this is a response to the threat that people felt that the world around them was causing for their lives, for the foundations of their faith, for the way that they lived, for the way that their ancestors lived, for the way that they were teaching their children to live. And so this is not just angry backward people not wanting to go along with the flow. This was people who were struggling to figure out, how do I live in a world where a lot of the things that I assumed were just true may or may not be true anymore. So in 1878, a Presbyterian pastor called for a Bible conference, and it took place in Niagara area in Canada that first year. It traveled around North America after that, but it was called the Niagara Bible Conference because that was where the first one was. And they established the term fundamentalism. And they called themselves fundamentalists because they believed that they were adhering to the 5 fundamentals. The Bible is inerrant. There are no errors in the Bible. Jesus is divine. Jesus was born from a virgin. Jesus physically resurrected, and Jesus will return again. So those are the 5 fundamentals. And because one of their fundamentals is that the Bible is inerrant, the Bible has no errors, the Bible fell out of the sky, and because we have now this assumption that we read the Bible literally, we have to oppose the idea that we could read the Bible from a critical perspective. Because science is bringing up these questions, some people said, oh, well, that means that I need to reconsider my faith and develop new tools for how to understand this. And so biblical criticism developed. How do you interpret the Bible? Well, let's think about where the original context comes from, and let's think about why this was written, and let's think about the language that's used, and the development of the forms that we're seeing in here, and the sources, and all these different things that we've talked about in this class before. Some people went in that direction. Others said, no. What I know is true is that my Bible is what my Bible is, and it's never going to change. And so the world around me is going to have to conform to that. I am not going to conform my faith to the world. And that's what the fundamentalists did. So this is kind of getting to the moment of crisis with this development. We've got a more or less fully developed evolutionary theory. They've got a more or less developed creationist understanding theory. And they come to a head in the famous Scopes trial. We have the monkey trial. And the Scopes trial was not the only one of these, but it was the most famous one because it was I was going to say essentially, but not even essentially. It was set up as a publicity circus intentionally to get attention from the press, to make money, basically. William Jennings Bryan, who was a very popular figure, was one of the lawyers, and Clarence Darrow, who was a famous ACLU member and defense attorney, was the other. And so these were already very popular, very divisive figures that were going head to head. And they basically marketed it as they were putting evolution on trial. They were putting the Bible on trial. Could William Jennings Bryan defend the faith in the face of this heathen atheist Clarence Darrow? Is how they marketed this. And when it was happening, it was really hot. So they actually ended up having the trial outside for some of the days. And so they have all these really great pictures because they have outdoor, lighting for their earlier photography. And these guys are, surrounded by these huge crowds of people arguing with one another and giving these impassioned speeches about whether we should go with the Bible or whether we should go with this evolution idea. And really, the trial was about this teacher, Arthur Scopes, who broke the law in Tennessee because the law at the time said that he was not allowed to teach evolution in his classroom, and he did it anyway. And at the end of the day, he lost the trial. But 5 days later, William Jennings Bryan died. And when he died, he left a huge vacuum of leadership in this early fundamentalist movement that kind of pushed it off to the side. And so really, Darrow and Scopes lost the trial, but evolution won the war. Just because William Jennings Bryan happened to die within 5 days of this trial, and they just couldn't find somebody as popular and impassioned and emboldened as Bryan was to champion their cause. But that's not the end. By the 1960s, so 40 years later, this small group of people who were anti-evolution and kind of had been shoved off to the side started to develop their own ideas. They were no longer just anti something, they wanted to be pro something. And so they started to develop creation science, claiming scientific evidence for their literal interpretations of the Bible. And so we get the young earth creationists, we get flood geology, where people are trying to come up with ways to interpret geological findings in terms of the flood. They use sort of pseudoscience, fake science to prove their biblical narratives as historical facts. That's what they're attempting to do. That's what they're focused on in their efforts. By the 1980s, we get concepts like intelligent design, that there's no way in the complexity of the way that our world works that it could have just come about randomly, that there has to be some kind of intelligence behind it. Irreducible complexity, the idea that you can't trace back the complexity of, for example, how a human brain works all the way back to a single cell organism. That's impossible to do. And then also in 1980, you get the founding of a group called Answers in Genesis. And I want to talk about them here at the end of my brief history of creationism, because I think that at this point, with Answers in Genesis, we have kind of reached the pinnacle of creationism. In 2007, Answers in Genesis, this organization, founded the Creation Museum, which is still there today. You can go and visit it. It's in Kentucky, right over the border from Cincinnati, Ohio. And this is a museum that takes the impulse in conservative Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity to answer every question using logic to its absolute extreme. So I wanted to share with you just one example of this so that you kind of get a concept of what I'm talking about. And this is just an example, but this is the kind of thing that you find all over this museum. This is a placard, and it says, rafting. When the flood destroyed the world's forests, It must have left billions of trees floating for centuries on the ocean. These log mats served as ready-made rafts for animals to cross oceans. The paths of ocean currents carrying these rafts would explain similar animals and plants on opposite sides of oceans. And then they have a map there that shows how certain plants can be found in Northern Europe and also Northern North America, that there are similar plants that you can find in Western Africa and Eastern South America, etc. They find a reason for every scientific fact using some kind of pseudo-logical explanation that they can come up with. So what they want us to believe is that the flood historically actually factually happened. And wouldn't it make sense that when there's a huge flood that destroys the entire world, all the trees from the forest that were destroyed would have floated up to the top of the water. And for centuries, this would have covered the oceans. And then the oceans would have been, had these log mats, and they were basically rafts. The animals could cross from continent to continent. And that's why we see these similarities in the types of animals. There's no such thing as Pangea. There's no such thing as the development of the earth. It's always looked this way. It's always been this way. But the answer to this question, this particular question, is rafts. And this happens again and again and again and again and again. And if you buy into this logic, if you twist yourself into all these different pretzels to explain things, then you can come up with an answer for everything. And this is how I was raised. This is what I was taught was necessary to be a Christian in this world. And so this is something that is really, I don't want to call it near and dear to my heart in like a nice way. This is something that affected me greatly as I was growing up and developing my faith. And eventually I personally just got to a point where I said, this is ridiculous. Do we really have to come up with something like this in order to justify our faith? Or is there really something more important going on here than arguing about how, animals got to two sides of an ocean? I don't know. Some people obviously disagree with me. We have to prepare for the onslaught of Satan. We have to have an answer to every question. We have to be able to logic our way out of every corner. And I spent a lot of years learning how to do that. And it's taken me a long time to undo that, that impulse in myself, that I can just sit with a question and not have to instantaneously answer it. Like Natalia, I don't answer any of your questions. So, questions, comments to this point. We're gonna wrap it up here pretty soon, promise. Good. All right. So we're almost there. So I wanted to just bring up two ideas that I think are essential to this question that people would bring up a question like asking about Christianity and evolution. Why is that important? What is, what's going on here that we feel there is a clash? And I think the first thing that is challenging to Christians is the question of humans and human uniqueness. Charles Darwin actually left out his ideas about human evolution on purpose in his earliest publications. He didn't talk about human evolution at all. But even as he published his early publications, his opponents picked up on where this was going and used that as kind of a rallying point against him anyway. And very quickly, they started to debate over the similarities and differences between humans and modern apes. Is it possible that we come from the same ancestor as these these monkeys. I know, not monkeys, apes. And then they would, they asked questions like, is it really possible that Darwin is right on this? Can the different pressures of the environment result in all of these differences that we see between humans and apes? Or is this worth, I guess kind of at the end of the day, the question is this worth shaking my faith to its core? Because when it comes to human uniqueness, that's a very different question than the idea of the evolution of other species. I think we can buy the idea that other species developed from each other much more easily than we can humans. Why is that? I think because of Genesis chapter 1. God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Oh, good job, Katie, typing that weird. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. So our Bible tells us that not only did creation develop over time, that there is some kind of order from simple to complex, but it tells us that we are the pinnacle, that we are God's crowning achievement. We are made in the image and likeness of God. We are different than all the other animals. So how dare you suggest that all we are is the development of any of the other animals? Darwin said that the differences between the human mind and what we're capable of and the minds of other higher animals is just a matter of degree, not a difference in kind. We are not different than those other apes. We are just a little bit further along. And so our language is more developed, our tool use is more developed, etc. But if that's true, then how do we understand this? What does this mean? That we are different. We are made in the image of God, unlike anything else, that we are made to rule over everything else. How do we wrestle with that? How do we grapple with that? That's a question that we have to ask when we're thinking about how we understand science and religion to interact with one another. And then I think another thing that kind of is in conflict here potentially is that teleology idea that I was talking to you about earlier. What is the end goal? Where are we headed? What is the purpose here? I think that if we were to say, what would pure evolution say is the answer to this question. What is the end goal? Where are we headed? Pure evolution would say we're not headed anywhere. We just change because each iteration of a species uses everything that it has to survive and reproduce. So sometimes the change is random and it results in death. Other times the change is random and it results in some kind of positive development, but that doesn't mean that it's going anywhere. It just kind of goes around in circles forever. But that's not actually true if you think about it logically, because there is kind of a subconscious system with an end goal, which is to produce the best specimens that are most capable of survival, or something in that vein. So there is a purpose. It's just not conscious. It's not guided. It's kind of the way that the world works, so to speak. But there is still kind of an end game, which is to become the best, right? To survive. But then on the other side, if we say, well, what would pure creationism say? Pure creationism would say that we are not headed anywhere because there's no movement. We've always been and always will be what God created us to be. But even that's false on its face in terms of theology, because we're supposed to be growing and changing. We're supposed to be moving forward in our relationship with God and developing spiritually and developing physically and developing emotionally and in our relationships with each other. And so that can't really be right either. So there's no such thing, I think, as pure evolution with no end goal. And there's no such thing as pure creationism with no sense of development, no sense of growth. I don't think either of those things can possibly exist. And because they can't exist, then we have no choice but to have some kind of relationship between the two concepts. We just have to figure out what that is. And I want to bring up for this one, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, which says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." So I think even the Bible kind of points to the idea that we are something. We are God's people. We are important. We are special, but that there is still movement. God called us out of darkness. We are moving from ignorance to knowledge. We are moving from fear to understanding. We are moving from chaos to order. And so there is a sense of change, of evolution in us, even if we don't want to accept that, even within our own scriptures, even within our own theologies and our own faith systems, there is a sense of that development. So I think it just comes down, I don't think it's possible to have this concept that evolution and Christianity are diametrically opposed, because we have concepts of evolution in our faith, and we have concepts of growth and change and purpose even built into our scientific explanations of the world. So I'm ready to wrap it up here. What is the relationship between Christianity and evolution? Well, I love this quote. This is from Thomas J. Ord, who is both a scientist and a theologian in the modern day. He still lives, he still teaches. He said, "The Bible tells us how to find abundant life, not the details of how life became abundant." So he's reminding us that the way that we read the Bible, how we read the Bible, is essential to all of this stuff. I don't know if you've noticed this, but we're on question number 45. And I would say that out of 45 questions, at least 40 of them have really, even though I've been talking about other things, have really been the question, how do you read the Bible? Because that's always the bottom line. The bottom line is always, what are the tools that you're using to interpret the Bible? What is the Bible for? What is the Bible not for? Because if we are reading the Bible for details of how life became abundant, you can find them. You can find whatever you want in the Bible. There's all kinds of crazy stuff people are claiming that they found in the Bible all the time. But is that the purpose of the Bible? What is the Bible attempting to do? Well, Thomas J. Ord reminds us that the Bible is about telling us how to find abundant life, not how life became abundant. So how we read the Bible, what we're looking for in the Bible, changes what we think the Bible is telling us. I think that something else that we can learn from this question is that this very process of developing our ideas about evolution, even developing our ideas of creationism, is a gift from God. The scientific process, inquiry, curiosity, teamwork, experimentation, all of these things are gifts from God that are innate to who we are as humans. And I think it has something to do with that image of God. What does that mean? What does it mean that we are built in the image of God? Everybody's going to have a different answer to that question. But I think that even the stuff that threatens us, even the ideas that challenge us, are part of being made in the image of God. And so I don't think it's a bad thing to have those questions and to make those inquiries and to have those conversations and to attempt to not be threatened by them, because what we're trying to do is progress, to develop, to move from fear to understanding. Because I think that those things are kind of the opposites, from darkness to light, from fear to understanding. You fear that which you don't understand. And so how do we get into that process in a way that is faithful to what God is calling us to be and do in the world, but also faithful to the tools that God has given us for understanding our world? think that's an important question for all of us to wrestle with. And I think fundamentally, the reason why Christianity and evolution are not contradictory is because they're not asking the same question. Evolution asks and addresses how. Christianity asks and addresses why. How did this happen? Why did this happen? And I think if we are taking the how question and we are applying it to our faith, we're applying it to our reading of scripture, we are misreading, we are misinterpreting, and then frankly, we are underutilizing our scriptures and our revelation from God. Because God is not talking to us about how, God is talking to us about why. And so keeping in mind which question we're talking about, I think, helps us to reconcile these concepts. So I bring to you this week 2 passages. Usually I only bring you 1, but I had to bring you 2 this week. And these are both about God's perspective on us, which is fairly unusual to find in the Bible. Most of the time it's about our perspective of God, what we get from God. But this is about what God gets from us. Psalm 18:19 says, "He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me." And Zephaniah 3:17 says, "The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exult over you with loud singing." So what these passages tell us is that God delights in us. God didn't just create things for the sake of creating things. God loves this stuff. God loves who we are. God loves to see us being us. And so I think that when we refuse to do that, when we refuse to buy into the natural curiosity, the natural inclination to work together, to solve problems, to answer questions, I think when we deny that about ourselves, that is us denying the image of God in us. God delights when we are us. And so when we talk about these questions of evolutionary theory, we shouldn't be afraid of them. We should think about how we can learn from them and grow in our relationship with God and our understanding of God and our understanding of who God is by observing the world. And so that is what I bring to you as a final thought for this week. What are your final thoughts before we get out of here? I know I talked for a really long time today, sorry.
Where do we begin? I don't know, Katie. Just need some mulling over, I guess. Maybe it's the simple-mindedness of my brain. I get it, and I obviously enjoy what I hear, but I also, it's still clashing. It doesn't walk together. But I truly believe, the not being literal, sure. But at the end of the day, I'm just always thinking of it from the position of when I argue with my parents.
Mm-hmm.
If I argue this, I can't argue it. Do you know what I'm saying? It is what was written in the Bible. And yes, I can tell them, well, you can't be literal, but then they're like, well, this is God's book. He wrote this. I'm like, well, through the people. And like you said, how you read the Bible. I mean, it's you can't teach that to people. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Oh, yes. I do know what you're saying.
Right. Like listening to you, you're the origin of the modern day. Basically, you're saying all of these things. You know what I mean? Never heard that name before, by the way. So you're my origin. Is that how you say?
Yeah, origin.
Exactly. So, I mean, always good food for thought, and wish me luck if I ever talk to my parents about it.
No, I think it comes down to this this disconnect. I mean, you think that you are having a conversation with someone, but you're talking completely past each other, because all of the foundations of your arguments are things that each other does not agree with. Like the assumptions that you bring to the table for the conversation are not assumptions that the other person is making. And so you can't have that conversation. You can't come to any kind of agreement with each other because you haven't unpacked those assumptions. And there's a lot of fear in fundamentalism of unpacking those assumptions, because when something is unknown, when something is unanalyzed, when something is unconsidered, and it is such a foundational element of your faith, you don't want to find out what you don't know about yourself, right? You can't. And the longer you build on that, the harder it is to accomplish that. And so it's really frustrating and difficult, because I can come to the table and I can talk to, like, my parents are the same way. I can talk to them and unpack all of my assumptions and be open and vulnerable with them, but they just can't do that. And so my big question, maybe you guys can teach me something, because I've never been able to figure out. My big question in the world is, how do you talk to these people? How do you engage with somebody who is not ready to be engaged with about this stuff, who just can't bring themselves to a place where they can even accept that there might be another set of assumptions that somebody else might bring?
Well, I think even listening to you, I found it very interesting, because they're always the perspective that I have in my head, right? So, like, we went to Italy and look at those statues from like way long time ago. And my dad turned out to be a very skeptical person. Like, how do you know this is not a clone? Like, this is not the real, David, whatever statue. This is something new that they made last year, because the original one is broken. How could they keep it like this? And then even my mom believes in that the Pangea, it used to all be connected, and then over million years. So you believe in that million years, the age of Earth. But then when we talk about the talking snake and Adam and Eve, well, that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? It's like there is no wiggle room there.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, I'm a very skeptical person, and this could not possibly happen. But then when it comes to the Bible, that really did happen.
Yep.
You can't argue. You can't question. It's just what it is. Wait, so you believe in a talking snake, but you can't believe that the statue of David is 1,000 years old. You can't believe that. But the talking snake from like, however, 2,000, 3,000 years ago is true.
Definitely true. Yes.
Definitely true.
Yes. I'm right there with you, Natalia. I'm just a couple decades ahead of you in terms of this process. That's all. That's the only difference between you and me, believe me.
So yeah, if I can't argue with them, that's why I feel like it's not answered in my book. Because I can't, you know what I'm saying? Because I won't win. And if I don't win, well, it's not answered.
Then I guess you're just gonna have to start ripping up their assumptions.
They just read the Bible. Okay.
All right. Anybody else have any final thoughts to share today?
Well, Katie, I think that God gives us a lot of different tools to figure out the world and our place in it. And I think evolution is just one of those tools, that we can use to explain some things that otherwise we wouldn't be able to explain. But I have that brother-in-law that I discuss Christianity with all the time, and who maintains that he doesn't believe any of it or in any religion. But he's a philosophy major, or he was, in college. And I just pointed out to him that everybody chooses a philosophy to live their life. And this happens to be mine. and he can respect it for that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so oftentimes he calls me on Thursday night and he'll ask me, well, did you do your book club this morning? I'll say, yeah. And he'll say, well, what was your question today? You know, so I think you just have to kind of meet people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
You can't really change their mind if they've got a different idea. So,
Yeah.
but
Well, that
this was really good.
That, Karen,
Huh?
is a perfect transition to revealing next week's topic, because next week's topic is, what is religious tolerance?
Oh, that's good. We didn't set that up ahead of time.
No, we did not. I promise you. All right. Well, thank you for hanging in with me late, friends. I know it's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to let you all go. I really enjoyed this question, and I will add these new questions that we've come up with. Let me know what new other questions come up. And next week we will talk about religious tolerance.
Okay.
Thank you, Katie.
Thanks,
Good
everybody.
night.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Katie. Good night, all.
Good
Good
night.
night.